A revolutionary technology born from necessity. The fog rolled thick across the English Channel on that gray morning in 1943, obscuring everything more than a few meters away. To the untrained eye, such conditions would have brought military operations to a standstill. Aircraft couldn't fly, ships couldn't navigate, and ground forces couldn't see their targets. But high atop the cliffs of Dover, a peculiar rotating antenna spun continuously, its operators staring intently at a glowing green screen that revealed what human eyes could never perceive. They could see through the fog, through the darkness, through the very clouds themselves. This wasn't magic. It was centimetric radar, one of World War II's most closely guarded secrets, and perhaps the most significant technological advantage the Allies possessed. The story of how this revolutionary technology came to be is not just a tale of scientific achievement, but a narrative of desperate necessity, brilliant minds working against impossible odds, and the kind of innovation that only emerges when the stakes couldn't be higher. While Nazi Germany had pioneered early radar technology in the 1930s, it was the British and their American allies who would perfect the ability to see through weather, darkness, and the fog of war itself, literally and figuratively. This is the story of centimetric radar, the cavity magnetron, and how a device small enough to hold in your hand changed the course of history. The problem: blind warriors in a modern war. To understand the revolutionary nature of centimetric radar, we must first understand the desperate situation facing the Allied forces in the early years of World War II. The Battle of Britain raged in the skies above England, with Luftwaffe bombers striking British cities night after night during the Blitz. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sending merchant vessels to the bottom of the sea and threatening to starve Britain into submission. The threat was existential, and the limitations of existing technology were painfully apparent. Early radar systems, operating on longer wavelengths, had certainly proven their worth. The chain-home radar stations that dotted Britain's coastline had provided crucial early warning during the Battle of Britain, giving RAF fighters precious minutes to scramble and meet incoming German raids. But these early systems had severe limitations. Operating at wavelengths of several meters, they were enormous installations that couldn't be mounted on aircraft or small vessels. Their resolution was poor. They could detect that something was out there, but couldn't provide precise information about size, exact position, or altitude. More critically, these long-wavelength radars couldn't see through weather. Fog, rain, and clouds created interference that could mask enemy aircraft or ships. They also couldn't detect low-flying aircraft effectively, leaving a dangerous gap that German bombers exploited. For ships at sea, the situation was even worse. Naval vessels equipped with early radar could detect other ships at reasonable distances, but had no way of distinguishing between enemy warships and friendly merchantmen until they were close enough for visual identification, which, in foggy conditions, might mean it was already too late. The problem was particularly acute for Bomber Command. British bombers striking targets in occupied Europe flew by night to avoid German fighters, but navigating to their targets was extraordinarily difficult. Crews relied on dead reckoning, celestial navigation when the stars were visible, and sheer guesswork when they weren't. The result was that most bombs fell miles from their intended targets. Reconnaissance photographs revealed the embarrassing truth. Even on clear nights, less than 1/3 of bomber crews got within 5 miles of their targets. On cloudy or foggy nights, the percentage plummeted. Britain was expending enormous resources and losing hundreds of air crews in bombing raids that were having minimal impact on Germany's war machine. At sea, the U-boat menace was reaching a crisis proportions. German submarines could lurk beneath the waves, surface at night to attack convoys, and slip away before escorts could respond. Even when escorts were present, detecting a submarine on the surface at night or in poor weather was nearly impossible with existing radar. The submarines presented such a small target, and the sea return, the radar reflection from waves, created so much clutter that U-boats could operate with relative impunity in anything but perfect conditions. Anti-aircraft defenses faced similar problems. Searchlights and optical rangefinders were useless in fog or clouds. Heavy anti-aircraft guns fired thousands of shells with minimal effect because they couldn't accurately track their targets. Night fighters attempting to intercept German bombers had to rely on ground controllers guiding them into the general vicinity of the enemy, then hope for a visual sighting. In poor weather, interceptions were rare. The Allied High Command understood that winning the war would require solving these problems. They needed a radar system that could provide precise targeting information, that could see through any weather, and that was small enough to install in aircraft, on ships of all sizes, and in mobile ground installations. They needed, though they didn't yet know it was possible, centimetric radar.
The science. Understanding wavelengths and why shorter is better. To appreciate the breakthrough that centimetric radar represented, we need to understand some fundamental physics of electromagnetic waves. Radar works by transmitting radio waves and detecting their reflections from objects. The wavelength of these radio waves, the distance between successive wave peaks, fundamentally determines what the radar system can and cannot do. Early radar systems operated at wavelengths measured in meters, typically between 1 and 10 meters. These long wavelengths had certain advantages. They required less sophisticated electronics to generate and detect. They could be produced with relatively high power, and they propagated well over long distances. The chain home stations could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles, which was crucial for early warning. But long wavelengths brought severe limitations. The resolution of any radar system, its ability to distinguish between two closely spaced objects, is directly related to wavelength. A radar operating at a wavelength of 3 meters cannot distinguish between objects separated by less than several meters. This meant that early radars could tell you that there were aircraft in a particular area, but couldn't tell you how many, what type they were, or exactly where they were within that area. For naval use, this was particularly problematic because it made it impossible to distinguish between the superstructure of a battleship and a small merchant vessel at any significant range. The wavelength also determines the minimum size of object that can be effectively detected. Objects much smaller than the radar wavelength reflect very little energy back to the receiver. A submarine conning tower presenting a target perhaps 2 meters across would reflect some energy from a 3-meter wavelength radar, but not very efficiently. Reduce the wavelength to 10 centimeters, however, and suddenly that submarine becomes a much more prominent target. There's also the matter of beam width. The angular width of a radar beam is proportional to the wavelength divided by the antenna size. To create a narrow, focused beam with long wavelength radar requires an enormous antenna. The chain home stations used antenna arrays that stretched hundreds of feet high precisely because they needed to create beams narrow enough to provide useful directional information. But such massive antennas couldn't possibly be installed in aircraft or on small vessels. Shorter wavelengths solved all these problems simultaneously. A radar operating at 10 centimeter wavelength in the centimetric band could achieve excellent resolution with an antenna small enough to mount in an aircraft's nose or on a destroyer's mast. It could detect small objects like submarine periscopes or conning towers that were nearly invisible to longer wavelength systems. And crucially, it could see through fog and light rain with minimal interference. The physics of why centimetric radar works better in poor weather conditions is somewhat counterintuitive. While it's true that shorter wavelengths are more susceptible to absorption by water droplets, the concentration of water in fog or light rain is actually quite low. The key advantage is that centimetric radar can separate the small returns from weather phenomena from the much stronger returns of solid objects like ships or aircraft. The improved resolution means that the target stands out clearly against the background clutter. Additionally, the narrower beam means that the radar is looking at a smaller volume of space at any given moment, which reduces the total amount of weather-related interference. But there was a problem. Actually, several enormous problems. Generating radio waves at centimetric wavelengths required electronic oscillators capable of functioning at frequencies between 1 and 10 gigahertz, far higher than anything that existed in the late 1930s. The vacuum tubes that powered existing radar transmitters simply couldn't oscillate fast enough. Even if they could, generating sufficient power at these frequencies seemed impossible with known technology. A usable radar system needed to transmit thousands of watts of power in short pulses to achieve practical ranges. Nobody knew how to do that at centimetric wavelengths. Scientists on both sides of the conflict understood the theoretical advantages of shorter wavelengths. German researchers, British physicists, and American engineers had all explored the problem in the late 1930s. But as war clouds gathered over Europe, everyone assumed that practical centimetric radar was years away, if it was possible at all. The consensus was that existing meter wavelength technology would have to suffice for whatever conflict lay ahead. That consensus was about to be shattered by a device the size of a hockey puck invented in a university laboratory in Birmingham, England.
The breakthrough: the cavity magnetron and a new kind of radar. The University of Birmingham was not one of Britain's most prestigious institutions in 1939, but it had a small physics department doing interesting work on microwaves. Professor Marcus Oliphant led the department, and among his researchers were two men whose names deserve to be far better known: John Randall and Harry Boot. These two physicists had been working on microwave generation for several years, exploring the theoretical possibility of creating oscillators that could function at centimetric wavelengths. The fundamental challenge they faced was getting electrons to oscillate at frequencies measured in gigahertz. Conventional vacuum tubes used grids to control electron flow, but at such high frequencies, the electrons simply couldn't respond fast enough to the changing voltages. What Randall and Boot needed was a way to make the electrons themselves create the oscillation through their physical motion, rather than trying to control them with external voltages. They turned to an existing concept called the magnetron, a device that used magnetic fields to bend the paths of electrons inside a vacuum tube. Earlier researchers had created crude magnetrons, but they were inefficient and produced very little power. What Randall and Boot realized was that by creating resonant cavities, precisely shaped holes, in a copper block surrounding the magnetron, they could harness the natural resonant frequency of these cavities to stabilize and amplify the oscillation. The insight was brilliant, but the execution was remarkably practical. In early 1940, working with limited resources and under increasing pressure as the war intensified, they created a device that looked deceptively simple. A solid copper cylinder about the size of a large can of soup had 8 carefully machined holes around its circumference, all connected to a central vacuum chamber. A strong magnet created a field perpendicular to the cylinder's axis. When high voltage was applied, electrons spiraling in this magnetic field would pass by the openings to the cavities, inducing electromagnetic oscillations. These oscillations fed back on the electron stream, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that generated continuous microwave radiation. On February 21, 1940, they tested their cavity magnetron for the first time. The results exceeded their wildest expectations. The device produced 400 watts of continuous power at a wavelength of 9.8 centimeters, well into the centimetric band. More importantly, when operated in pulsed mode as radar required, it could generate kilowatts of power in short bursts. This was orders of magnitude more power than anyone had thought possible at these wavelengths. Professor Oliphant immediately recognized the significance. Here was the key to compact, high-resolution radar that could be installed anywhere. He reported the results to Henry Tizard, who chaired the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense, the body coordinating British radar research. Tizard grasped the implications instantly. This was potentially war-winning technology. But Britain in 1940 was in desperate straits.
The fall of France had left the nation standing alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain was beginning, with the Luftwaffe attempting to gain air superiority as a prelude to invasion. Britain's industrial capacity was stretched to breaking point, producing conventional weapons, Spitfires, Hurricanes, tanks, ships. The sophisticated engineering and precision manufacturing required to turn the cavity magnetron from a laboratory prototype into thousands of mass-produced units seemed beyond reach, at least in the time frame that mattered. Moreover, there was a genuine fear that Britain might fall. If Germany invaded successfully, they would capture this revolutionary technology, along with all the research notes and prototypes. The Nazis would gain a decisive technological advantage precisely when Britain most needed to maintain its lead in radar development. Tizard made a bold decision. Britain would share the cavity magnetron with the United States and Canada, providing complete technical specifications and production prototypes. In return, North America's vast industrial capacity would be harnessed to produce the devices in quantity and to develop the complete radar systems that would use them. It was an extraordinary act of technological sharing between nations, unprecedented in warfare and born of both desperate necessity and remarkable trust. In September 1940, a technical mission led by Henry Tizard himself traveled to North America carrying the most valuable cargo that had ever crossed the Atlantic. Among the suitcases of documents and the boxes of equipment was a cavity magnetron, only one of 12 that existed in the world. When American scientists at the radiation laboratory at MIT saw it demonstrated, they were stunned. E.G. Bowen, one of the British delegates, later recalled that Edward Bowles, an MIT professor who was a scientific advisor to the U.S. War Department, examined the device and declared, "This is the most valuable cargo ever to reach American shores." Bowles wasn't exaggerating. That single device would spawn an industrial and scientific effort that would eventually produce nearly 100 different radar systems, transform warfare at sea and in the air, save countless thousands of lives, and help win World War II. But that was still in the future. In late 1940, the challenge was to turn a laboratory curiosity into practical military hardware.
Development from laboratory to factory to battlefield. The establishment of the Radiation Laboratory at MIT, universally known as the Rad Lab, in November 1940 marked the beginning of one of history's most successful crash programs in military technology development. The laboratory brought together hundreds of physicists, engineers, and technicians with a single mission: develop practical radar systems using the cavity magnetron and get them into production as quickly as possible. The first priority was the magnetron itself. The Birmingham prototype worked, but it was hand-built by skilled researchers who could afford to spend days machining each component to precise tolerances. Mass production would require standardized designs that could be manufactured by the thousands with consistent performance. Western Electric took on the challenge, assigning engineers to study the British design and develop manufacturing processes that could produce magnetrons in quantity. The problems they faced were daunting. The cavities had to be machined to tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch. If they were even slightly the wrong size, the resonant frequency would shift and the magnetron wouldn't operate at the desired wavelength. The vacuum inside the device had to be extremely high. Even tiny amounts of residual gas would cause arcing in failure. The cathode that emitted electrons had to be precisely centered and properly treated to ensure consistent electron emission. Every seal had to be perfect. Every component had to withstand the thermal stress of operation. By mid-1941, Western Electric had developed production techniques that could manufacture magnetrons reliably. Other companies joined the effort: General Electric, Raytheon, Westinghouse, each taking on different aspects of the production challenge. By the end of the war, American and British factories would produce over 1 million cavity magnetrons, an achievement that seems almost miraculous given that the first prototype had operated for the first time less than 5 years earlier. But the magnetron was only the beginning. A complete radar system required transmitters to pulse the magnetron, receivers sensitive enough to detect the faint echoes returning from distant targets, antennas to focus and direct the radar beam, display systems to present the information to operators, and power supplies to run everything. Each component had to be developed essentially from scratch because nothing like them existed for centimetric wavelengths. The antenna problem was particularly interesting. The ability to create narrow, focused beams was one of the great advantages of centimetric radar, but it required antennas with parabolic reflecting surfaces that could focus the microwave energy just as a curved mirror focuses light. The RadLab engineers designed dozens of different antenna configurations for different applications. Some used parabolic dishes that rotated continuously to scan the area around a ship or aircraft. Others used fixed antennas with electronic beam steering that could change the direction of the radar beam almost instantaneously. The display technology evolved rapidly as well. Early radar systems used A-scope displays that showed signal strength versus range as a simple oscilloscope trace. Operators had to be highly trained to interpret these displays, and extracting precise target information was difficult. The RadLab developed the Plan Position Indicator, or PPI display, which revolutionized radar operation. The PPI showed a map-like view with the radar at the center and targets appearing as bright spots at their actual positions relative to the radar. As the antenna rotated, the display swept in synchronization, building up a complete picture of everything in the radar's coverage area. For the first time, operators could see at a glance where all the targets were, how fast they were moving, and where they were heading. Different applications drove different radar designs. Naval surface search radars needed long range to detect enemy ships or aircraft approaching a task force. They typically operated at wavelengths around 10 centimeters and used large rotating antennas to scan the horizon continuously. Fire control radars needed extreme accuracy to guide naval gunfire. These operated at shorter wavelengths, around 3 centimeters, and used sophisticated tracking mechanisms to follow targets precisely. Anti-aircraft radars needed to detect targets anywhere in the sky and provide accurate altitude information for ground controllers and automatic gun-laying systems. For aircraft, size and weight were critical constraints. Every pound of equipment in a bomber reduced the bomb load it could carry or the range it could fly. RadLab engineers worked obsessively to miniaturize components. The radar systems that equipped night fighters and maritime patrol aircraft in 1943 were marvels of compact design, packing capabilities that would have required truck-mounted equipment just 2 years earlier into installations that weighed a few hundred pounds. The development of airborne intercept radar installed in night fighters to detect and track enemy bombers, exemplified the rapid pace of innovation. The first systems, deployed in 1941, could detect targets at ranges of 2 to 3 miles, which was just barely adequate for a fighter pilot to complete an interception before the bomber reached its target. But subsequent versions improved rapidly. By 1943, the SCR-720 radar, used in American P-61 Black Widow night fighters, could detect bombers at ranges exceeding 4 miles and track them precisely enough that pilots could execute attacks in complete darkness or in thick cloud. Maritime patrol aircraft received some of the most sophisticated radar systems developed during the war. The ASV radar allowed patrol bombers to detect submarines on the surface at night or in poor weather. Early in the war, U-boats had adopted the tactic of running on the surface at night to recharge their batteries, confident that aircraft couldn't find them in the darkness. The deployment of ASV radar devastated this tactic. Suddenly, U-boats cruising on the surface at night were being caught and attacked by aircraft they never saw coming. The Germans were aware that the Allies had airborne radar. They captured examples from shot-down aircraft, but they were baffled by how the technology worked. German radar experts examined the captured equipment and concluded it was impossible.
They knew that generating sufficient power at centimetric wavelengths was theoretically impossible with known technology. Surely the equipment must operate at longer wavelengths, and the apparent centimetric design was some kind of deception. They searched in vain for the real explanation, while Allied aircraft fitted with increasingly sophisticated centimetric radar hunted their submarines and bombers with impunity.
Combat operations. The technology proves itself. The true test of any military technology is its performance in combat, and centimetric radar proved itself spectacularly across every theater of war. Its impact on the Battle of the Atlantic was particularly dramatic, and quite possibly decisive in the outcome of the entire war. By 1942, the U-boat campaign had brought Britain to the brink of starvation. German submarines were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, and the flow of supplies from America was threatened. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's submarine force, had perfected the Wolfpack tactic, where multiple U-boats would coordinate attacks on convoys, overwhelming the escorts and inflicting massive losses. The turning point came with the deployment of centimetric radar on escort vessels and patrol aircraft. The Type 271 radar, operating at 10 centimeters wavelength, could detect a submarine's conning tower at ranges of several miles, even in fog or rain. Destroyers and corvettes equipped with this radar could suddenly find U-boats that were trying to shadow convoys while remaining just beyond visual range. The submarine's previous advantage, their ability to maneuver into attack positions under cover of darkness or bad weather, evaporated. One particular engagement illustrates the technology's impact dramatically. In May 1943, convoy ONS-5 crossed the Atlantic with 42 merchant ships and an escort group that included several vessels fitted with Type 271 radar. Dönitz directed a Wolfpack of 30 U-boats to intercept and destroy the convoy. Over 6 days of running battle, the escorts detected and drove off submarine after submarine, preventing them from achieving good attack positions. When U-boats tried to close in at night, expecting to be invisible, they found escorts bearing down on them with deadly accuracy. The battle ended with 13 U-boats sunk or severely damaged for the loss of 13 merchant ships, a victory for the Allies, and the first time an attacked convoy had inflicted more losses than it suffered. The impact multiplied when centimetric radar was installed in patrol aircraft. The Lee light, a powerful searchlight mounted on aircraft, had already proven somewhat effective at catching surfaced submarines. But submarines learned to dive as soon as they detected the radar emissions from meter-wavelength ASV radar sets. The Germans developed detector equipment that gave U-boats warning when they were being illuminated by Allied radar, allowing them to dive before aircraft could attack. Centimetric ASV radar changed this deadly game completely. Operating at wavelengths the German detectors couldn't receive, the new radars allowed aircraft to approach U-boats without warning. Even better, the improved resolution meant that aircraft could detect submarines at greater ranges and track them precisely even in rough seas. A consolidated B-24 Liberator fitted with centimetric ASV radar and patrolling over the Bay of Biscay could detect a submarine 10 miles away and track it continuously until within attack range. The submarine crew would have no warning until they heard the roar of engines overhead and saw the aircraft diving to attack. The statistics tell the story. In the first half of 1943, before centimetric radar became widespread, U-boats sank about 3 million tons of Allied shipping. In the second half of the year, with centimetric radar in widespread use, sinkings dropped to half that figure, while U-boat losses increased dramatically. By 1944, the U-boat threat, while never entirely eliminated, had been reduced to manageable proportions. The Battle of the Atlantic was won, and centimetric radar had been one of the decisive weapons. In the air war over Europe, centimetric radar transformed both bombing accuracy and night fighter effectiveness. The H-2S radar, a ground mapping system that operated at 3 centimeter wavelength, allowed bombers to navigate accurately and identify targets even when the ground was completely obscured by clouds.
The radar created a map-like display of the terrain below, with cities, coastlines, rivers, and major landmarks clearly visible. For the first time, bomber crews could navigate to their targets with precision regardless of weather. The operational impact was revolutionary. Before H-2S, bombing raids in poor weather were essentially canceled because crews couldn't find their targets. After its introduction in early 1943, Bomber Command could attack in any weather. More importantly, bombing accuracy improved dramatically. Raids using H-2S to identify targets achieved circular error probabilities measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. While this doesn't meet modern standards of precision, it represented a quantum leap over the area bombing necessitated by earlier navigation limitations. Night fighters equipped with centimetric AI, airborne intercept radar, became deadly hunters. The Bristol Beaufighter and de Havilland Mosquito, equipped with AI Mark 8 radar, could detect German bombers at ranges exceeding 4 miles, track them precisely, and guide the pilot into position for a visual attack, or, increasingly, into position for a radar-guided gun attack that didn't require visual sighting at all. German bomber crews flying missions over Britain faced an enemy who could see them clearly in complete darkness through any weather. The German Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign effectively ended, and when Germany attempted to resume night attacks in 1944, losses were so severe that operations ceased for just a few weeks. In the Pacific theater, centimetric radar proved equally valuable. Naval task forces equipped with air search radars operating at 10-centimeter wavelength could detect incoming Japanese air raids at ranges exceeding 100 miles, providing ample time to launch fighters and prepare defenses. The technological advantage was so pronounced that by 1944, Japanese air attacks on American carriers had almost no chance of achieving surprise. Surface combat was transformed as well. The Battle of Surigao Strait, fought in October 1944, demonstrated the capabilities of fire control radar dramatically. American battleships equipped with Mark 8 fire control radar operating at 3-centimeter wavelength detected the approaching Japanese fleet at a range of 22 miles in total darkness. They opened fire at ranges exceeding 10 miles, achieving devastating accuracy without ever seeing their targets visually. The Japanese force was annihilated in what was essentially the last battleship engagement in history, and it was fought almost entirely by radar. Perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of centimetric radar's capabilities came in the European Air War in a series of operations targeting German night fighters. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had developed effective night fighter tactics, shooting down hundreds of British bombers. German night fighters used their own radar systems, operating at longer wavelengths, to find British bombers. The British response was Serrate, a system that detected the radar emissions from German night fighters and honed on them. British Mosquito night fighters, equipped both with Serrate and their own centimetric AI radar, would hunt the hunters. They would detect the German radar emissions, home toward them, and then use their own radar, which the Germans couldn't detect, to close in and attack. The psychological impact on German air crews was severe. They suddenly found themselves being shot down by an enemy they couldn't see and didn't know was there until cannon shells began tearing into their aircraft.
The technology's hidden impact, beyond direct combat. While the direct combat applications of centimetric radar were dramatic and obvious, the technology's broader impact on the war effort was equally significant, though less immediately visible. The very existence of reliable, high-resolution radar changed how military operations were planned and executed in profound ways. Naval operations, in particular, were revolutionized. Before radar, ships operated under severe constraints in poor weather or darkness. Formations had difficulty maintaining station because ships couldn't see each other. Maneuvering at night or in fog risked collisions. Complex tactical movements that required precise positioning were nearly impossible to execute except in clear daylight. These limitations fundamentally shaped naval doctrine and operational planning. Centimetric radar eliminated these constraints.
Ships equipped with surface search radar could operate in formation in complete darkness or thick fog with the same precision as in clear daylight. The radar displays showed the position of every ship in the formation continuously. Commands to change course or speed could be executed smoothly because each ship could see where all the others were. This seemingly mundane capability enabled much more aggressive naval operations. Task forces could operate at night without fear that ships would lose contact with each other. High-speed dashes to intercept enemy forces could be executed in any weather. For amphibious operations, centimetric radar proved invaluable. Landing craft approaching a beach at night or in poor visibility could use radar to navigate precisely to their assigned positions. Control vessels could monitor the entire assault wave, directing individual craft to correct any deviations from the planned approach. The D-Day landings in June 1944 and subsequent amphibious operations in both Europe and the Pacific demonstrated this capability repeatedly. Thousands of vessels maneuvered in darkness and marginal weather with a coordination that would have been impossible just a few years ago. The impact on air operations extended beyond direct combat effectiveness. Air traffic control, primitive and largely manual in the early war years, became much more capable with centimetric radar. Controllers could see aircraft clearly on their displays and provide precise guidance. This mattered enormously for bomber operations, where hundreds of aircraft had to assemble into formations, fly to targets in potentially poor weather, and return to land at bases that might be fogged in. Ground-controlled approach radar using centimetric wavelengths to track aircraft on final approach with great precision allowed bombers to land safely in weather that would have previously meant diverting to alternate airfields, or worse, aircraft running out of fuel while searching for a place to land. The ability to operate in poor weather also had strategic implications for the bombing campaign. Germany's war production was concentrated in regions like the Ruhr Valley, areas frequently covered by clouds and industrial haze. Before H-2S radar, attacking these targets required clear weather, giving German defenses time to prepare when weather forecasts predicted breaks in the clouds. With H-2S, attacks could come at any time regardless of weather, forcing Germany to maintain its defenses at full readiness constantly. This imposed significant costs in terms of manpower, ammunition expenditure, and the psychological stress on both defenders and civilian populations, who could never be certain when the next raid might come. The technology also enabled entirely new types of operations. Pathfinder forces, elite bomber units equipped with the most sophisticated radar and navigation equipment, would arrive over targets first and mark them with flares or indicator bombs for the following main force. This concentrated bomber streams on targets more effectively than any previous method. While German cities still suffered massive destruction, the moral implications of which remained deeply troubling, the precision was sufficient to target specific industrial facilities, rail yards, and military installations when desired. Mine warfare, an often overlooked aspect of the naval conflict, was transformed by centimetric radar. Aircraft fitted with radar could detect mines floating on the surface or just below it, allowing mine-sweeping operations to proceed more efficiently. More significantly, the ability to navigate precisely in poor visibility meant that minefields could be laid with great accuracy in strategic locations like harbors, shipping lanes, and coastal waters. The mining of Germany and Japanese waters by aircraft, conducted largely at night using radar navigation, eventually contributed significantly to the collapse of both nations' maritime transportation networks. Search and rescue operations benefited enormously as well. Aircraft or ships in distress could be located much more quickly by search aircraft fitted with centimetric radar, even in poor weather that might have made visual searching impossible. The radar could detect life rafts, debris, or oil slicks that indicated where a downed aircraft or sunken ship might be. Thousands of Allied airmen and sailors owed their lives to the fact that rescue aircraft could find them in conditions where they would have otherwise been undetectable.
The German response: too little, too late.
Germany's failure to develop centimetric radar comparable to Allied systems was one of the war's most consequential technological shortcomings. It wasn't for lack of understanding the theory or the potential value. German scientists and engineers were world-class, and they certainly grasped what centimetric radar could accomplish. But a combination of institutional failures, resource misallocation, and some unfortunate technical decisions left Germany increasingly vulnerable as Allied radar capabilities advanced. German radar research in the late 1930s had actually been ahead of Britain's in some respects. The Germans deployed operational radar systems for air defense before the British did, and their early warning network was sophisticated and effective. But German research focused on improving meter wavelength systems rather than pursuing the much more difficult challenge of centimetric wavelengths. This made sense in the context of pre-war and early war thinking. The existing technology worked adequately, development resources were limited, and the path to incremental improvements was clear. German scientists did explore microwave generation, but they pursued different approaches than the British. They worked on klystrons and traveling wave tubes, devices that could generate centimetric wavelengths but produce much less power than the cavity magnetron. When these approaches failed to yield practical radar systems, the research program lost momentum and priority. By 1941, when the radiation laboratory at MIT was ramping up to full capacity, German microwave research was basically stagnant. The German High Command compounded the problem through a disastrous policy decision. In late 1940, convinced that the war would be won quickly, they ordered that no new weapons development programs be initiated unless the weapon could be ready for combat within 1 year. This crash program mentality, intended to focus resources on immediate combat needs, had the effect of killing long-term research. Work on advanced technologies that might not pay off until 1942 or 1943 was terminated or reduced to minimal levels. Given that Germany had already missed the cavity magnetron breakthrough that was occurring simultaneously in Britain, this policy virtually guaranteed they would never catch up. Germany first became aware of Allied centimetric radar in early 1943 when they recovered equipment from shot-down aircraft. Initially, they simply didn't believe what they were seeing. The equipment was clearly designed to operate at wavelengths around 10 centimeters, but German experts insisted this was impossible. They knew that generating sufficient power at these wavelengths exceeded the capabilities of any known technology. Some speculated that the equipment was deliberately planted deception, designed to mislead German research efforts. Others theorized that it operated at longer wavelengths and the physical design was merely intended to confuse analysts. It took months of examination and some breakthroughs in understanding how the cavity magnetron functioned before German scientists accepted that the Allies had solved a problem they themselves had abandoned as intractable. By then, the technological gap was enormous. The Allies were deploying dozens of different centimetric radar systems in operational use, while Germany was still trying to understand the basic principles of the key component. Germany did eventually develop a cavity magnetron in late 1943. The device worked, but by then it hardly mattered. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture magnetrons in quantity while also producing all the other radar components. More critically, they lacked the institutional knowledge and experience that Allied engineers had accumulated over 3 years of intensive development. The Rad Lab alone had hundreds of engineers who had spent years working exclusively on centimetric radar systems. No German institution had comparable expertise. Some German radar developments were quite sophisticated and showed real innovation. The Würzburg radar, operating at longer wavelengths, was an excellent design that provided German air defenses with effective targeting information throughout the war. German night fighters developed their own radar sets that were, within the constraints of their technology, reasonably effective. But these incremental improvements couldn't overcome the fundamental disadvantage of operating at longer wavelengths. The operational impact of this technological gap became more severe as the war progressed. By 1944, Allied aircraft operated with near impunity in all weather conditions, while German forces were increasingly blind whenever visibility was poor. Allied naval forces could fight effectively at night or in fog, while German ships had to avoid combat in such conditions or risk being destroyed by enemies they couldn't see.
The asymmetry was profound and contributed significantly to Germany's defeats in both the Atlantic and Mediterranean naval campaigns.
Perhaps most frustrating for German commanders was that they understood exactly what was happening and were essentially helpless to counter it. They knew Allied aircraft were using sophisticated radar. They developed radar detectors to give warning when their own radar emissions were being picked up, but these were almost useless against centimetric systems because German detector technology worked at longer wavelengths. They tried jamming Allied radar, but without knowing the exact frequencies being used or having transmitters capable of generating sufficient power at centimetric wavelengths, their jamming was largely ineffective. The Luftwaffe's attempts to counter British night bombing illustrate the problem vividly. German night fighters achieved considerable success in 1943 and early 1944 using their own radar systems and sophisticated ground-controlled intercept procedures. But as the Allies deployed better radar systems and countermeasures, German effectiveness declined. By late 1944, RAF Bomber Command was suffering less than 2% losses on most raids, despite facing hundreds of night fighters. The German pilots were skilled and brave, but they were fighting with inferior technology against an enemy who could see clearly while they groped in the darkness. German U-boat crews faced similar frustration. By mid-1943, submarine commanders reported being attacked by aircraft that appeared suddenly out of darkness or cloud with no warning whatsoever. U-boats had detector equipment that could sense meter-wavelength radar emissions, providing precious seconds to dive before an aircraft arrived. Against centimetric ASV radar, these detectors were useless. Submarines would be cruising on the surface when suddenly bombs or depth charges would explode around them, the first warning of an attack that had been developing for several minutes while the aircraft homed in using radar the U-boat couldn't detect. Admiral Donitz understood the situation clearly. In his memoirs written after the war, he identified Allied radar as one of the decisive factors that defeated the U-boat campaign. The enemy, he wrote, had succeeded in finding some means of location which we did not understand. When German engineers finally captured and understood centimetric radar equipment, Donitz realized that the technological gap was unbridgeable, given Germany's deteriorating industrial situation. Japan faced even worse problems. Japanese radar research lagged behind both the Allies and Germany throughout the war. The Japanese never developed anything approaching Allied centimetric radar capabilities. By 1944, American naval forces enjoyed such overwhelming advantages in radar technology that Japanese ships couldn't effectively fight at night or in poor weather at all. Multiple engagements in the Solomons and Philippines campaigns demonstrated American ships detecting, tracking, and destroying Japanese forces that had no idea they were even being observed until shells began landing around them. The technological asymmetry extended to air combat as well. Japanese aircraft radar development was minimal, and most of their fighters had no electronic equipment beyond radios. American night fighters hunting Japanese bombers attacking shipping or bases had sophisticated radar that could detect targets at several miles range and track them precisely for attack. Japanese bomber crews had no radar warning equipment and no defense against attacks coming out of complete darkness. The result was predictable. Japanese night bombing operations became suicide missions with loss rates that made them operationally ineffective.
The post-war legacy, how radar changed everything. When World War II ended in 1945, the victorious Allied nations found themselves in possession of radar technology that was years ahead of anything available before the war. The military applications were obvious and would continue to be developed and refined throughout the Cold War. But the broader impact of centimeter radar on civilian technology and society was equally profound, though it took years to fully manifest. The most immediate post-war application was in aviation. Commercial airlines had suspended most operations during the war, and when they resumed in the late 1940s, they inherited radar technology developed for military use. Weather radar, derived directly from airborne intercept systems, allowed pilots to detect and avoid dangerous weather conditions. This single capability made aviation far safer and more reliable. Airlines could maintain schedules in weather that would have previously grounded flights indefinitely. Air traffic control underwent a complete transformation.
The radar systems that had tracked hundreds of bombers assembling for raids over England were repurposed to track commercial aircraft. For the first time, controllers could see exactly where every aircraft in their airspace was located at any moment. This enabled much denser traffic patterns and more efficient use of airspace. The modern air traffic control system, handling tens of thousands of flights daily worldwide, would be impossible without the radar technology developed during World War II. Maritime navigation benefited enormously as well. Commercial ships adopted radar quickly in the post-war years, transforming maritime safety. Ships could navigate safely in fog, detect icebergs or other hazards, and avoid collisions. The number of ships lost to maritime accidents dropped dramatically. Harbor approaches became much safer, and port operations could continue in weather that would have previously shut them down. The global shipping industry, which underpins modern international trade, depends fundamentally on radar technology that traces its lineage directly to wartime development. Weather forecasting and meteorology were revolutionized by radar. Meteorologists quickly realized that the weather echoes that had complicated military radar operations contained valuable information about precipitation, storm structures, and atmospheric conditions. By the 1950s, networks of weather radars were being established to track storms and provide warnings of dangerous weather. The sophisticated weather radar systems used today, capable of detecting tornado formation, measuring rainfall rates, and tracking hurricanes, evolved directly from World War II centimeter radar technology. Less obvious but equally important was radar's contribution to the birth of modern electronics engineering. The Radiation Laboratory at MIT brought together hundreds of engineers and physicists who worked on every aspect of radar systems. They developed new circuit designs, new manufacturing techniques, new testing procedures, and new ways of thinking about electronic systems. When the war ended, these people dispersed to universities, to private industry, to new technology companies. They took with them not just specific technical knowledge, but entire methodologies for developing complex electronic systems. Many of the fundamental concepts of modern electronics can be traced to wartime radar development. The idea of a systems engineering approach, considering how all components of a complex system interact rather than optimizing each piece individually, emerged from radar work. Signal processing techniques developed to extract weak radar returns from noise and clutter became foundational for communications engineering. Display technology advanced dramatically due to the need for better radar screens. Even something as mundane as coaxial cable was refined and standardized largely to meet radar requirements. The cavity magnetron itself found unexpected applications. In 1946, Percy Spencer, an engineer at Raytheon working with magnetrons, noticed that a chocolate bar in his pocket had melted while he stood near an operating radar set. He realized that the microwaves were heating the chocolate and began experimenting with cooking food using microwave energy. By 1947, Raytheon had produced the first microwave oven, a commercial unit that stood 5 feet tall and weighed over 700 pounds. The technology was refined over subsequent decades, and by the 1970s, microwave ovens had become common household appliances. Every microwave oven today uses a magnetron that is a direct descendant of the device Randall and Boot created in 1940. Radio astronomy benefited dramatically from radar technology. The receivers and antenna systems developed for radar operated at frequencies that were ideal for detecting natural radio emissions from celestial objects. After the war, many radar installations were converted to radio telescopes, and many radar engineers became radio astronomers. The field of radio astronomy, which has revealed so much about the universe, from pulsars to the cosmic microwave background, might not exist in its modern form without the technological foundation provided by World War II radar development. Medical imaging was transformed by technologies that emerged from radar research.
The signal processing techniques, display technology, and understanding of electromagnetic wave propagation that radar engineers developed found applications in ultrasound imaging, CT scanners, and eventually MRI machines. While these medical technologies involved different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum and different physical principles, the engineering approaches and many specific techniques came from people trained in radar development during and after World War II. The economic impact was substantial as well. The companies that manufactured radar equipment during the war, Western Electric, General Electric, Raytheon, RCA, and many others, emerged with advanced capabilities in electronics manufacturing and considerable experience in complex systems integration. These capabilities positioned them to dominate the emerging electronics industry in the post-war decades. The American electronics industry's global leadership in the 1950s and 60s was built partly on foundations established during wartime radar production. Universities benefited from the dispersal of radar expertise as well. Many physicists and engineers who worked on radar development returned to academic positions after the war, bringing with them both technical knowledge and substantial research funding. The Office of Naval Research and other military agencies continued to fund research in electronics, signal processing, and related fields. This created a virtuous cycle where academic research advanced the state of the art, trained new generations of engineers and scientists, and maintained America's technological leadership. The social and cultural impact is harder to quantify, but nonetheless real. Radar became a symbol of scientific achievement and technological progress. The fact that scientists and engineers had developed technology that could see through fog and darkness captured public imagination. This contributed to increased prestige for science and technology in the post-war years and helped drive the expansion of technical education and research funding that characterized the 1950s and 60s.
The human element. Lives saved and lost. Behind the statistics, the technical specifications, and the strategic impact were individual human beings whose lives were profoundly affected by centimetric radar. The technology saved lives on a scale that's difficult to fully comprehend, but it also contributed to destruction and casualties that remain troubling decades later. Consider a British merchant sailor aboard a convoy ship in the North Atlantic in early 1943. His ship was one of 40 in a convoy being hunted by a wolf pack of U-boats. Without centimetric radar, the convoy's escorts would have been largely blind at night and in the fog that frequently blanketed the North Atlantic. Statistically, his chances of surviving the crossing were perhaps 50-50. Several ships in the convoy would almost certainly be torpedoed, and survival rates for merchant sailors in frigid North Atlantic waters were poor. But his convoy had escorts fitted with Type 271 radar. When U-boats attempted to close in for attack positions, the escorts detected them miles away and drove them off before they could launch torpedoes. When one submarine did manage to fire, the escorts immediately detected it and attacked so aggressively that it was forced to dive deep and flee. The convoy reached port with all ships intact. That merchant sailor survived not because of any action he took, but because of technology he probably didn't even know existed. Multiply this story by thousands of convoys and hundreds of thousands of merchant sailors, and you begin to understand radar's impact on the Battle of the Atlantic. Or consider a Royal Air Force bomber crew flying a mission to the Ruhr in late 1943. Previous raids had been disasters, with bombers scattered across hundreds of square miles, trying desperately to find their targets through clouds and industrial haze. This crew's Lancaster bomber was equipped with H-2S radar. The navigator could see the Rhine River clearly on his radar display despite solid cloud cover below. He guided the pilot precisely to the target area. The bombs fell accurately on the assigned industrial facility, and the bomber returned safely to base. The crew survived dozens of missions that would have been far more dangerous without radar navigation.
But consider also the German civilians in that industrial facility, or in the city around it. Some undoubtedly died in the bombing raid that radar technology made possible. The same technology that saved Allied lives also enabled destruction on a massive scale. The moral calculus here is complex and troubling. The bombing campaign against Germany remains controversial, with historians still debating whether the civilian casualties were justified by military necessity. What's undeniable is that centimetric radar made the bombing campaign more effective, which means it bears some responsibility for both the legitimate destruction of German war production and the deaths of civilians. American naval aviators in the Pacific owed their lives to radar technology repeatedly. A fighter pilot launched from a carrier to intercept incoming Japanese aircraft knew his ship's radar operators had detected the enemy formation when it was still 50 or more miles away. He had time to gain altitude, position himself advantageously, and coordinate with other fighters for the attack. Without that radar warning, the first indication of an attack might have been when bombs began falling on the carrier. The difference between ordered interception and desperate last-minute scrambling was often the difference between survival and death. For Japanese airmen on the receiving end, the experience was frustrating and demoralizing. They would approach what they thought was an unsuspecting American task force, only to find fighters already at altitude waiting for them. American combat air patrols seemed always to be in exactly the right position, almost as if they knew where the attack was coming from. They did know, of course, because radar gave them complete awareness of the tactical situation. Japanese losses in air combat climbed steadily as American radar capabilities improved, and those losses included thousands of pilots whose training had taken months or years, but whose lives ended in minutes against an enemy with overwhelming technological advantages. German night fighter crews had similar experiences. Luftwaffe pilots who flew against RAF Bomber Command in 1943 achieved considerable success shooting down hundreds of British bombers using their own radar-equipped night fighters. But by late 1944, the same pilots found themselves being hunted by Allied aircraft equipped with superior radar systems. The hunter had become the hunted. German pilots reported the unnerving experience of flying routine patrols and suddenly being attacked by enemies they never saw. The psychological impact was severe. It's one thing to face a more numerous enemy or even a more skilled one. It's something else entirely to face an enemy who seems to see you perfectly while you remain blind. For the thousands of RAF bomber crewmen who died over Germany, radar was often irrelevant. It couldn't protect against flak, couldn't prevent all night fighter interceptions, couldn't guarantee survival of the desperate gamble that every bombing mission represented. But for many who did survive, radar navigation systems were crucial. They helped crews find their way home when wounded, navigate through weather that would have otherwise doomed them, and avoid straying into areas of particularly heavy defenses. Search and rescue personnel had countless stories of finding downed aviators or shipwrecked sailors because radar allowed them to search effectively in conditions where visual searching would have been hopeless. A life raft bobbing in rough seas is nearly impossible to spot from an aircraft unless conditions are perfect. With centimetric radar, that same life raft produced a clear return that search aircraft could detect from miles away. The survivors who were rescued often never knew that radar had saved their lives. They just knew that somehow the search plane had found them when all seemed lost. The U-boat crews who died in the Atlantic, thousands of young German sailors, fell victim partly to technology they couldn't counter. The youngest submarine service members, teenagers pressed into service in the desperate final years of the war, climbed aboard boats that were essentially death traps by 1944. The statistical odds of surviving a U-boat patrol had declined to terrible levels, and Allied radar was a major reason why. These were human beings with families and futures who died in cold ocean waters because they served in a military force that had lost the technological race. The development teams that created centimetric radar faced their own pressures and sacrifices.
Engineers and scientists at the Rad Lab and at British research establishments worked crushing hours under enormous pressure. They knew that lives depended on their work, that every day's delay meant more ships sunk, more aircraft lost, more lives ended. Some suffered nervous breakdowns from the stress. Others ruined their health with the long hours and constant pressure. A few died in accidents during testing or deployment of experimental equipment. Production workers in the factories that built hundreds of thousands of radar sets worked similar hours under similar pressure. These were often women, filling manufacturing jobs as men went into military service. They assembled intricate electronics with the knowledge that a single mistake could mean a radar set that failed in combat, possibly costing lives. The pressure was intense, the work demanding, and the recognition minimal.
Technical challenges and engineering triumph. The engineering challenges involved in turning the cavity magnetron from a laboratory curiosity into reliable, mass-produced military equipment were extraordinary. The problems weren't just about making the magnetron itself work, though that was difficult enough, but about creating complete, integrated radar systems that could operate reliably in the harsh conditions of military service. Consider the environment a typical airborne radar had to survive. Aircraft flying at high altitude experienced temperatures far below zero, yet the radar had to work perfectly. The same aircraft might descend to low altitude in the tropics, where temperatures and humidity were both extreme. Violent maneuvers imposed gravitational forces that could damage delicate components. Vibration from engines and propellers subjected every part to continuous shaking. Combat damage might punch holes in the aircraft's skin, exposing equipment to sudden decompression or ingress of moisture. Any of these conditions could destroy improperly designed electronics. The magnetron itself required careful engineering to survive these conditions. The vacuum seal had to remain perfect despite thermal cycling that made different parts of the device expand and contract at different rates. The cathode had to continue emitting electrons consistently, despite being subjected to gravitational forces during aircraft maneuvers. The magnetic field had to remain stable even as the temperature varied by 100 degrees or more. Achieving all this required careful materials selection, sophisticated manufacturing techniques, and extensive testing. Power supplies presented their own challenges. The magnetron required several thousand volts at high current to operate, demanding power supplies that were efficient, compact, and reliable. Early designs used conventional vacuum tube rectifiers and transformers that were bulky and heavy. Engineers worked to miniaturize these components, developing more compact transformer designs and more efficient rectifier circuits. By late in the war, power supplies that would have weighed several hundred pounds in 1941 had been reduced to a few dozen pounds while actually improving in reliability. The transmitter had to generate precise, short pulses of microwave energy. The magnetron couldn't simply run continuously. It had to be turned on and off thousands of times per second, with each pulse lasting only a microsecond or so. The timing had to be precise, the pulse shape had to be consistent, and the system had to do this reliably for hundreds or thousands of hours of operation. This required sophisticated pulse-forming networks and high-voltage switching systems that could handle enormous power levels without failing. Receiver design presented different but equally challenging problems. The radar needed to detect echoes that might be millions of times weaker than the transmitted pulse. The receiver had to be extremely sensitive while also being immune to interference from the aircraft's own electronics, from enemy jamming, and from natural sources of radio noise. The receiver also had to recover quickly after each transmitted pulse. If it remained blinded too long, it couldn't detect returns from nearby targets. Engineers developed super-heterodyne receivers with multiple stages of amplification and sophisticated automatic gain control circuits that adjust in sensitivity based on the strength of returns. They created noise-reducing circuits and filtering systems that rejected interference while preserving target echoes. They designed discrimination circuits that could distinguish between returns from aircraft and returns from ground clutter, or sea return.
Each of these innovations required extensive development, testing, and refinement. The antenna systems were marvels of mechanical and electrical engineering. Naval search radars used rotating parabolic antennas that had to spin continuously, often in high winds and salt spray, for months at a time without failure. The antenna had to remain precisely aligned as it rotated, and the rotation rate had to be stable to ensure the display presented accurate information. The rotating joint that connected the antenna to the fixed transmitter and receiver had to pass microwave energy with minimal loss while allowing continuous rotation. This required waveguide rotary joints that were precision machined and carefully maintained. Fire control radars needed antennas that could track targets with extreme precision. The antenna had to follow a moving target smoothly and accurately, compensating for both the target's motion and the motion of the ship or aircraft carrying the radar. This required servo systems with feedback loops that could make continuous corrections at high speed. The mechanical systems had to be stiff enough to maintain precise pointing, yet light enough to respond quickly to control inputs. Designers used lightweight materials like aluminum and magnesium alloys, precision bearings, and sophisticated servo amplifiers. For airborne radars, particularly those installed in fighters, space and weight constraints were severe. Every cubic inch and every pound mattered. Engineers created incredibly compact designs, packing components tightly and using every bit of available space. Some airborne radars were so densely packaged that maintenance required essentially disassembling the entire system to replace a single component. Maintenance ability suffered, but operational capability improved dramatically. Display technology evolved rapidly to meet operational requirements. The early A-scope displays, showing signal strength versus range as a simple trace, were replaced by PPI displays that showed a map-like view of the tactical situation. Creating a stable, clear PPI display required cathode ray tubes with long persistence phosphors so that the image wouldn't fade completely between successive antenna rotations. It required sophisticated sweep circuits that synchronized the display with the antenna rotation. And it required careful attention to preventing blooming, reflection, and other artifacts that could make the display difficult to read when operators were often working under stressful conditions. For some applications, particularly fire control, even more sophisticated displays were needed. These might show range, bearing, and elevation simultaneously, or might overlay multiple sources of information on a single display. The technology was pushing the limits of what cathode ray tubes could do, and engineers had to be creative in finding ways to present complex information clearly to operators who were often working under stressful conditions. Reliability was a constant concern. A radar system that worked perfectly in a laboratory but failed repeatedly in operational use was worse than useless. It gave commanders false confidence in capabilities they didn't actually possess. Engineers conducted extensive environmental testing, subjecting equipment to temperature extremes, humidity, vibration, and shock to identify weak points. They analyzed failures to understand root causes and developed design improvements. By late in the war, radar reliability had improved to the point where most systems could operate for hundreds of hours between failures. Manufacturing quality control was equally critical. As production ramped up from dozens of units to thousands to eventually hundreds of thousands, maintaining consistent quality was challenging. Companies developed sophisticated testing procedures to verify that each radar set met specifications before being shipped. Magnetrons were tested individually for output power, frequency, and efficiency. Complete radar sets underwent system-level testing to verify that all components worked together properly. The testing infrastructure required to support mass production was itself a major engineering accomplishment. Field maintenance presented another challenge. Radar equipment in combat zones had to be maintained by technicians who might only have basic training and limited test equipment. Engineers designed radar sets with this in mind, making subsystems modular so that faulty components could be quickly replaced. They created simplified test procedures that technicians could follow with minimal equipment. They wrote maintenance manuals that were clear and comprehensive, often including troubleshooting flowcharts that guided technicians through diagnostic procedures. The training challenge was substantial. Radar operators needed to understand not just how to operate the equipment, but how to interpret what they were seeing on their displays. An experienced operator could distinguish between a ship and a submarine, identify aircraft types by their radar signatures, compensate for weather effects, and recognize equipment malfunctions. Training programs had to convey this knowledge to thousands of operators quickly and effectively. Technical training for maintenance personnel was even more demanding. Radar systems incorporated sophisticated electronics that were far more complex than most other military equipment of the era. Maintenance technicians needed to understand vacuum tube theory, waveguide propagation, antenna principles, and system integration. Training programs often conducted at universities or technical institutes compressed what might have been years of education into months of intensive study.
Strategic implications. The radar war within the war. While centimetric radar's tactical impact was obvious in individual battles and engagements, its strategic implications shaped the entire conduct of the war. The technology didn't just help win battles, it changed what kinds of operations were possible and influenced strategic decisions at the highest levels of command. The decision to launch the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, despite marginal weather forecasts, was made possible partly by confidence in radar capabilities. Eisenhower and his staff knew that naval forces could navigate and maintain formation in poor visibility, that airborne forces could find their drop zones using radar navigation, and that air support could operate even if clouds obscured the targets. Without centimetric radar, the invasion might have been delayed further, with potentially significant strategic consequences. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany was fundamentally shaped by radar capabilities. The decision to conduct large-scale daylight bombing by American forces, while British forces bombed by night, reflected both tactical considerations and the capabilities that radar provided. American bombers, flying in daylight, could navigate and bomb visually when weather permitted. British bombers, operating at night, when German fighter defenses were less effective, depended absolutely on radar navigation. H-2S radar made night bombing operationally feasible on a large scale. Without it, Bomber Command would have been forced to bomb only on clear nights when crews could navigate by stars and landmarks, drastically reducing the campaign's intensity. The effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign remains debated by historians. Some argue it was essential in destroying Germany's war production capacity and diverting resources to air defense. Others contend the results didn't justify the resources expended and the casualties suffered. But what's undeniable is that radar technology determined the shape and conduct of the campaign. The ability to bomb in any weather meant Germany faced constant pressure rather than intermittent attacks. This forced Germany to maintain extensive air defenses continuously, tying down resources that might otherwise reinforce the Eastern Front or defended against the invasion of France. The Battle of the Atlantic had clear strategic implications that were directly affected by radar technology. Britain's survival depended on keeping supply lines open across the Atlantic. If Germany had succeeded in cutting those lines through unrestricted submarine warfare, Britain would have been forced to sue for peace or face starvation and economic collapse. The defeat of the U-boat threat, to which centimetric radar contributed decisively, ensured that American industrial might could be brought to bear in Europe. Without secure Atlantic supply lines, the liberation of Europe would have been impossible. Churchill later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. He understood that all of Britain's courage, all of its strategic advantages, all of its alliances would be worthless if ships couldn't cross the Atlantic. The technology that broke the U-boat campaign, including but not limited to centimetric radar, quite literally saved Britain and altered the course of world history. In the Pacific, radar's strategic impact centered on maintaining control of vast ocean areas and enabling operations across enormous distances.
The island-hopping campaign that drove across the Pacific toward Japan depended on carrier task forces that could operate continuously regardless of weather. Radar enabled these task forces to defend themselves against air attack, to conduct their own air operations in all conditions, and to navigate safely through regions where visual navigation was often impossible due to clouds and rain. The submarine campaign against Japanese shipping, conducted primarily by American submarines, was also influenced by radar technology. American submarines equipped with surface search radar could detect targets at night or in poor visibility, press home attacks, and escape before Japanese escorts could respond. Japanese merchant shipping losses climbed to unsustainable levels partly because American submarines operated with technological advantages that Japanese anti-submarine forces couldn't counter. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan involved different considerations than the European campaign, but was similarly enabled by radar technology. The distances involved in flying from bases in the Marianas to targets in Japan were enormous. Navigational accuracy was crucial, and radar systems like AN/APQ-13 provided that accuracy even when targets were obscured by clouds. The devastating firebombing raids on Japanese cities in 1945 were conducted largely using radar navigation and radar-guided bombing through clouds. The decision to use atomic weapons against Japan occurred in a context where conventional bombing had already devastated Japanese cities, and that conventional bombing was made possible partly by radar technology. This doesn't diminish the moral weight of the decision to use atomic weapons, but it's worth noting that the technology that allowed precise navigation to Hiroshima and Nagasaki on specific dates regardless of weather was the same centimetric radar technology developed earlier in the war.
The intelligence war, keeping secrets and stealing them. The development and deployment of centimetric radar occurred in parallel with an intense intelligence struggle, as each side tried to understand the other's capabilities while protecting their own secrets. The Allies' success in maintaining the secrecy of the cavity magnetron while German scientists remained ignorant of its existence was one of the war's most remarkable intelligence achievements. Security around the cavity magnetron was extraordinarily tight. When the device was first developed in Birmingham, only a handful of people knew the details of how it worked. The British government classified all information related to the magnetron at the highest level. Even within the military and scientific establishments, access to information about the device was restricted on a strict need-to-know basis. The decision to share the magnetron with the United States created significant security challenges. The device had to be physically transported across the Atlantic, which was risky given that U-boats were active and aircraft occasionally went down. The Tizard mission took extraordinary precautions, carrying the magnetron in a specially designed case and ensuring that someone knowledgeable in its operation was always present. Had the ship or aircraft carrying the magnetron been captured by Germany, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Once production began in the United States, security became even more challenging. Thousands of people were involved in manufacturing magnetrons and building radar systems. Each of them represented a potential security breach. The military and intelligence services implemented extensive security protocols. Workers were screened carefully, given only minimal information about what they were building, and warned repeatedly about the importance of secrecy. Facilities that manufactured magnetrons or radar systems had armed guards, restricted access, and surveillance to prevent espionage. Despite these measures, some information inevitably leaked. German intelligence services knew that the Allies had advanced radar systems, and they worked continuously to learn more. They interrogated captured Allied air crews, examined shot-down aircraft, and monitored radio communications for any hints about radar capabilities. But the most detailed information came from captured radar equipment itself. When Allied aircraft were shot down, German recovery teams would rush to examine the wreckage, hoping to find intact radar equipment. By 1943, they had recovered numerous radar sets, including some with cavity magnetrons that were largely intact. German scientists examined these devices intently, trying to understand how they worked. But the magnetron's operation was not intuitively obvious, and German researchers initially reached incorrect conclusions about its function. Part of the problem was that German scientists were victims of their own expertise. They knew that generating significant power at centimetric wavelengths was theoretically very difficult. When they examined captured magnetrons, they looked for some trick, some clever solution to the problems they themselves had struggled with. The actual solution, the use of resonant cavities to stabilize and amplify oscillations, was so elegant and yet so different from what they had tried that they initially failed to understand it. There's a fascinating human element here. German scientists weren't stupid or incompetent. They were skilled researchers who had made significant contributions to radar technology. But they were trapped by their assumptions and their prior experience. They expected Allied radar to work in ways that were consistent with their own research paths. When it didn't, they struggled to adjust their thinking. This is a common phenomenon in scientific research and technological development. Sometimes the people most expert in a field are the ones most likely to miss a genuinely novel approach because it conflicts with their established understanding. By late 1943, German scientists had finally figured out how the cavity magnetron worked. They even developed their own versions, but by then the technological gap was immense and growing. The Allies had years of experience in manufacturing magnetrons and designing radar systems around them. They had hundreds of engineers who specialized in centimetric radar. They had established production lines capable of producing thousands of magnetrons monthly. Germany had none of this infrastructure, and given its deteriorating industrial situation, had no realistic hope of developing it. The Allies also benefited from reading some German communications through the Ultra program, which gave them insights into German knowledge of Allied radar capabilities. When intelligence indicated that Germany had captured intact radar equipment, Allied scientists and engineers could adjust their designs or deployment procedures to maintain whatever advantage remained. This real-time feedback about what the enemy knew was invaluable. Counterintelligence efforts worked to prevent German spies from learning about radar technology. Double agents fed misinformation to German intelligence services, sometimes providing accurate but outdated information to maintain credibility while withholding current developments. The success of these counterintelligence operations meant that German assessments of Allied radar capabilities were often incomplete or inaccurate, providing the Allies with additional advantages. The Soviet Union presented different intelligence challenges. The Soviets were nominally allies, but British and American leaders were cautious about sharing their most advanced technology with a regime that might become an adversary after the war. Some radar technology was shared with the USSR under Lend-Lease, but the most sophisticated systems, particularly centimetric radar, were provided in limited quantities and without complete technical information. Soviet engineers received radar equipment, but not always the detailed specifications or manufacturing information that would allow them to replicate it. This created some tension in the alliance. Soviet commanders wanted better radar systems to improve their air defenses and support their military operations. But Western leaders worried about technology transfer that might erode their post-war advantages. The compromise was to provide substantial quantities of operational radar equipment while limiting information about the most advanced technologies like the cavity magnetron. After the war, the Soviet Union conducted extensive efforts to understand and replicate Western radar technology. They had captured German equipment and scientists, examined Allied radar systems provided during the war, and pursued their own research programs. By the early Cold War years, Soviet radar capabilities had improved substantially, though they generally lagged behind Western technology by several years.
The human cost of technological advantage. While centimeter radar saved countless Allied lives and contributed to victory, it's worth reflecting on the human cost that the technology imposed, both directly and indirectly. Technology is never morally neutral. Its use reflects human choices and has human consequences. The bombing campaigns made possible by radar navigation killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. German cities were devastated, with casualties among non-combatants that remained troubling decades later. Japanese cities suffered similar or worse fates. While military necessity can justify targeting industrial facilities and infrastructure,
The reality is that many civilian deaths resulted from bombing campaigns that radar technology enabled. It's impossible to create a simple moral calculus here. Every German or Japanese civilian killed in bombing raids represents a human tragedy, a life ended, a family destroyed, suffering inflicted on people whose only crime was living under regimes they might not have supported. Yet those same bombing campaigns disrupted war production, degraded military capabilities, and ultimately contributed to shortening the war. How many lives were saved by ending the war sooner? There's no objective way to answer that question, but it's one that historians and ethicists continue to grapple with. The technology also created psychological effects that are difficult to quantify, but nonetheless real. German U-boat crews in 1944 knew that every time they surfaced, they might be attacked by aircraft they couldn't detect until too late. The psychological stress of this constant, invisible threat was severe. Many U-boat crew members suffered what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, assuming they survived at all. Japanese soldiers and sailors faced similar psychological pressure from American technological superiority. The experience of facing an enemy who seemed to see everything, who could operate in any weather, who had overwhelming advantages in detection and targeting, was demoralizing. While it's difficult to sympathize with military forces that committed atrocities throughout Asia and the Pacific, the individual soldiers experiencing this technological helplessness were human beings, often conscripts, who had little choice in their circumstances. The Allied personnel who operated radar systems also experienced psychological effects, though of a different nature. Radar operators sometimes watched as ships or aircraft they were tracking were attacked and destroyed. They saw blips on their screens disappear, knowing that each disappearing blip might represent dozens or hundreds of lives ended. Some operators struggled with the abstraction of it, death reduced to a vanishing phosphor trace on a screen. Bomber crews using H-2S radar to navigate to targets had to grapple with the knowledge that they were dropping bombs that would kill people below, even if those people were invisible beneath clouds or darkness. The radar made the bombing possible, but also created psychological distance from the consequences. It's one thing to see a factory being destroyed. It's another to see only a radar return that represents that factory, knowing that bombs are falling but unable to witness their effects. The engineers and scientists who developed the technology faced their own moral questions. Many were acutely aware that their work would be used to kill people. Some justified this by emphasizing that radar was primarily a defensive technology. It helped detect attacks and defend against them. But centimeter radar was also used offensively to find and attack targets that would have been safe due to weather or darkness. The people who developed H-2S radar enabled the burning of German cities. How should they have felt about that? Many veterans of the Rad Lab and other radar development programs thought deeply about these questions after the war. Some concluded that their work was justified because it helped defeat genuinely evil regimes. Others were more troubled, recognizing that the technology they developed had been used in ways that caused tremendous suffering. A few became active in peace movements or worked to prevent similar technologies from being developed for future conflicts.